All right. Welcome to the A's Philosophy YouTube channel. I am A's Philosophy, and today I wanted to broadcast my premiere, very first ID update. ID update number one. And ID, as many may know, stands for Intelligent Design. So basically, I want to present stories that come from the intelligent design community that basically support the idea that life, the universe, and all of reality is better explained by an intelligent source as opposed to naturalistic processes or an unintelligent source, whatever that might have been. Um, Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to put nearly as much time into this as I originally wanted to. I actually had to reschedule for people who may have seen the original community post. I originally said it was going to be one time, then another, then I changed it again. So actually, let me do a sound test right here. Very first. Yeah. All right, that works. Okay, good. So I had to change it a couple times. So I just wanted to put that out there for the small number of people who may have seen the original community post and seen it was a different time originally. Basically, I had to scramble, and I wasn't able to do nearly as much preparation for this as I wanted. So it's probably going to seem a little bit half-hearted, which is pretty sad because I think this is pretty important information. But nevertheless, it's we got Pratik. Good to see you. Yeah, it's a very interesting topic. And basically, what I'm just going to be doing is reading some stories. Today, all of them come from one particular website, which is run by Discovery Institute, which is, in my opinion, the best intelligent design source out there. It's a group of credentialed scientists who believe in intelligent design, and they write a number of wonderful articles. And their work goes back years and years and years. I don't know how long exactly, but many years. And I've been reading their work for many years. And I just decided that I'm going to pick a couple of stories that I think are worth mentioning. They're all worth mentioning in their own right. They're all very interesting, but I don't have time to review all of their work because it's just voluminous. So I'm going to pick a couple, and I think I'm going to do this periodically. I'm just going to pick a couple here and there. Maybe, I don't know. I'm trying to get at least once a month, but maybe more frequently, maybe less frequently. But about that, just some stories that I think are interesting, and just bring them to people so that they can see that there is real evidence, scientific evidence, not religious, philosophical, theoretical, but real scientific evidence brought to you by scientists. Uh, for clarification, what do you mean by intelligent design? Intelligent design is the idea that when we look at life or we look at the universe, it's better explained by its creation, and its existence is better explained by an intelligence, something that thinks, something that is aware, something that plans, as opposed to unintelligent causes like the forces of nature, basically mindless matter moving around in space, however you want to put it. The idea is that intelligent design better explains life and the universe over and against materialistic, naturalistic causes. Okay. So there is going to be the assumption that there is a dichotomy between intelligence and naturalism. All right. And we can discuss that at some point. But all right, let's get into the story because I really don't have much time, unfortunately. But let's get into this. So let's start off. The first story I want to bring to you, and all of these stories come from Evolution News website. And again, in the future, they might not all come from this website, but because today was my time to prepare was so limited, they all do come from this. It's evolutionnews.org is how you get to the website. And you can go back. There are articles going back. I don't know how far you can go and look for yourself. I think they go back maybe over a decade even. But they all come from this website today. And the first website is from Brian Miller on April 17th, 2025. New article calls for philosophical revolution in biology, placing mind over matter. So that's pretty interesting. So what is this about? So let's read it a little bit. I'm not going to read the entire articles because they're extremely wordy and kind of boring in parts, but I'm just going to try and give you the flavor of what's being said so that you can kind of have an idea of the ideas that are being discussed. I'm certainly not going to be able to cover every single detail. I don't think anyone wants that, but I want to kind of give you an idea, just a basic, broad overview of these kinds of concepts that are being discussed. And let's read a little bit. The three iconoclast scholars, Seymour Gart, Perry Marshall, and Stuart Kauffman, have published an article in the journal Entropy called "The Reasonable Ineffectiveness of Mathematics in the Biological Sciences." Seymour Gart is a biochemist at Rutgers University who has written widely on the intersection of faith and science. Perry Marshall founded Evolution 2.0, and Stuart Kauffman is a leading theorist studying self-organization. Their article argues that simple natural processes cannot explain embryological development. Instead, biology is directed by cognition, the capacity to make genuine choices and act creatively in responding to environmental cues to pursue goals. So right here, we already see that according to materialism, physicalism, naturalism, everything should be guided by strict, mechanistic, natural processes, which can be quantified mathematically. But what these scientists are saying, these scientists and philosophers are saying, is that when you actually start to study biology, that doesn't work. It appears that the listening intently, though it's not Sukkot. Oh, good. I'm glad to see you, Mike. What appears to be happening at the microscopic level and beyond is that mathematical, mechanistic processes are insufficient. And what this appears to signify, and I'm going to go on and read this, of why they think this, is that even at the cellular level, is this live or Memorex? This is live. I'm live right now, if that's what you're asking. Yeah. Thank you. Happy birthday. Thank you very much. So even at the cellular level, it appears that decisions are being made. And what is that? What do they mean by that? Yeah. I've had 3 birthdays in the last week, Mike, so I'm getting up there. The authors contend that mathematical relationships cannot capture the complexity of biological processes. This limitation poses a challenge to reductionism, the idea that understanding the physical and chemical properties of biological molecules will explain life's higher-level organization. Reductionism asserts that all biological phenomena are reducible to physics, and if physical processes are mathematically describable, then biology should, in principle, be largely explainable through mathematical models. This assumption entails biological processes almost entirely governed by rules-based dynamics, much like the laws of physics. That in turn leads to expecting these processes to be directed by algorithms, since algorithms are defined as step-by-step procedures that transform inputs into outputs based on defined rules. Yet the authors argue many biological operations are not computable, aka non-algorithmic. So if this is true, that would suffice to refute materialism and physicalism. This is a huge problem for so-called science, quote unquote. Because science nowadays is defined as everything is governed by physical laws. The laws themselves are entirely mechanistic. They can be quantified using mathematical models. And because our bodies are made of particles, which, are governed by these physical laws, then our biological processes should equally be modelable based on mathematical models or formulae. But what these scientists are saying is that when they observe the activities in the cell or wherever they're observing them, this is not happening. And they go on. I'm I'm going to read a little bit. So mathematics still provides a powerful tool for representing the abstract relationship between biological functions, but would only have detached from their physical components. Louis, drawing on Reshevsky, uses relational biology to demonstrate mathematically that some biological properties emerge from relationships that cannot be reduced to their physical components. Relational descriptions can apply to a large class of functionally identical but physically quite distinct systems. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. And you can go read this on your own if you want. The authors push the argument further by denying that chemistry generated the genetic code, and the genetic code eventually gained the required information to manifest cognition. They instead argued that cognition generated the genetic code, which enables life to control chemistry. Marshall argues that causation in biology is cognition to codes to chemicals, running in the opposite direction of the standard reductionist model, which is chemicals to codes to cognition. A single empirical example of a chemical process producing coded information would falsify this paper's thesis. Okay, so this is quite interesting, because what this scientist is essentially saying is that mind is governing the activity. First of all, mind is producing the codes that govern our lives, DNA. And then these codes are governing the activity of the chemicals. So our mind, so somehow cognition or awareness or thought is the source of what's happening in our bodies. And I'm pretty sure, okay, there's an example here. I read it earlier. Okay, maybe it's not here. Maybe I have to look at that. All right, so let's read at least one of these examples. See if we can find the other one because there was really an interesting example that I saw, which I'm not seeing right now. Yeah, I'm not seeing it here. I wonder where I saw it. Okay, so it's not in this article, but I'll find it. All right, so in the second example, cognition is demonstrated by planarians responding to the toxin barium. Similarly, when planarian flatworms are exposed to barium, a non-specific blocker of potassium channels, their heads undergo a process of degeneration due to the inability of neural tissues to maintain normal ionic balance. This results in the heads not developing or functioning correctly, and in some cases, the heads even explode or degrade entirely. When these planarians are kept in a barium solution, their remaining tails regenerate new heads that are completely resistant to barium. This occurs immediately. This adaptation is particularly fascinating because barium is not a substance that planarians can encounter in the wild, meaning there has been no evolutionary pressure to develop a specific response to it. This is a novel response to an unforeseeable event. Okay, that's actually quite interesting. It's hope everyone is happy. Good to see you, Andy. Yeah, that is this is a very interesting example of something where it doesn't appear that a mathematical model can explain, or a mechanistic scientific model can explain what this creature is doing. So it will automatically regenerate its entire head when introduced to this this chemical or this element. But that's not. I mean, as interesting as that is, I know there's another one that I saw that I think is actually in another article. Let me see if I can find it real fast. If I can't find it, but I do want to. I do want to kind of find it because it does. I think it perfectly illustrates. Sorry, I'm just kind of scrolling through the articles to see if I might have. Sorry, this is really bad production. Man, this is sad. Oh, here it is. Okay, this is. Oh, I think this actually was already. Oh yeah, actually had. Oh, that was an article I had already lined up. So let's read this. So this kind of follows along the same lines. This is an article I was going to bring up anyways from David Coppage on April 15, 2025. A cell makes decisions, but if it's following a material blueprint, how does it do that? So this is quite interesting. So scientists have noted for some time that it appears that cells can make decisions, and not just cells, but even components within cells. So subcellular components are apparently using intelligence to figure out problems that occur within the cell in a real-time basis. Now, this is pretty shocking because according to modern science, you need a brain to make decisions. You need a brain to generate consciousness, and you need a brain to generate thoughts. But if cells are making decisions, that would destroy that idea because obviously a single-celled organism can't have a brain because a brain requires many cells. Okay, so let's see what this article argues. So Sternberg, Plato's Revenge, The New Science of Immaterial Genome. All right, we're going to skip that. Watching an entertaining video in the press release from University of Massachusetts, UMass, called Rules of Engagement, set to Strauss-Waltz Voices of Spring, we see 4 varieties of enzymes deciding what to do when traveling along DNA strands and running into each other. So this is something that happens in the cell. You have DNA strands, okay? But the DNA strands themselves aren't that useful. You have to have basically little molecular machines that run along them and decode them and basically utilize them to do the things that DNA do. But as these little molecular machines, which are called enzymes, do these, they will inevitably run into each other. Like you can imagine 2 people walking down a very narrow path, and they run into each other and they have to walk around each other. They can't walk through each other. And this is exactly what happens in our cells. There are a bunch of little organelles in there, little molecules in there, and they're doing their intracellular activity. And eventually they run into each other. And if they're just following the principles of physics, then they will just bump into each other and not know what to do next. But what's incredible, and I don't think anyone has any explanation for what goes on, is somehow these molecular machines figure out a way to go around each other and keep doing their job. How that happens is quite bizarre. It's really inexplicable when you think about it, because it would probably indicate that these little, not even cells, little machines within cells are actually thinking and figuring out how to solve problems when they run into unexpected obstacles. It's extremely interesting. Anyways, we sympathize with these molecular actors, envisioning construction workers trying to work past each other in a narrow corridor. Somehow they figure out the challenge and carry on. Later in the video, we zoom out and see that all these interactions blend to a magnificent ballet, resulting in precise folding of DNA into the familiar X-shaped chromosomes. If a cell is merely a fortuitous concourse of atoms, how is this possible? Abiotic matter can self-organize in some circumstances. Tornadoes and hurricanes form spirals. Cooling lava forms hexagonal columns. Elements combine into geometric crystals. In those cases, though, the atoms simply follow physical laws without regard to consequences or function. Life is different. It solves problems for a purpose. It makes decisions. The condensins and cohesins, I hope I pronounced that correctly, in the video are not drawn into their interactions by gravity or electrostatics. Multiple levels of programming are involved, including genetic instructions to build molecular machines, 2, rules of engagement to govern their interactions, 3, an overarching design plan to compact DNA into chromosomes, and 4, a need to separate the chromosome pairs into daughter cells in mitosis. To these programs could be added monitoring systems, repair mechanisms, and the astonishingly complex DNA replication process. Programming makes the difference. Crystals, lava, and tornadoes do not follow a code telling them what to do. Philosophers and theologians may argue about whether laws are designed and finely tuned for life, but once established, the laws generate predictable outcomes that can be described mathematically. The actions of molecules in the cell are not predictable from laws, nor are the paths that electrons take in a silicon chip unless directed by a mind with a plan. The press release from UMass highlights a new paper in Science by Samehijina et al., explaining that the plan for chromosome construction succeeds despite stochastic interactions at the lower levels. And what they're basically saying is that there are so many things that can go wrong in the cell when these little things bump into each other. And if they were simply being guided by the laws of physics, everything would immediately be thrown off course. But somehow, in an almost miraculous way, these little cellular machines get their job done regardless of the obstacles that are put in their path. And it really is amazing when you think about it. I don't think science has a good explanation for how this happens yet. Given the dynamic interactions and stochastic nature of binding and loop extrusion processes, mitotic chromosomes do not adopt a single fixed three-dimensional structure. Instead, they are disorderly structured with a commonly defined architecture. By analogy, construction workers at a building project, each with their specialty and skills, have leeway in exact locations where they hammer nails or string wires, as long as they follow the overarching site plan shown in the blueprint. Here are additional examples of decision-making by cells to reinforce the point that material cells can only make decisions if specifically structured to follow a blueprint with rules of engagement. Let me read this. Is this too boring to read word for word? Yeah, I'm not gonna go on this. You can read it, but basically, you can read it on your own. What's go on? Have you theorized about how science can possibly detect or verify the existence of God? Well, yeah, of course I have. And one of the things that you don't necessarily, at this juncture, you can't, even if you want to say we can't prove God empirically, it's not always necessarily about proving God directly, but seeing the effects of an intelligent creator, if we want to use that term. So if you could show that something is necessarily the result of an intelligent process as opposed to a mechanistic, naturalistic process in terms of the creation of life or the universe, I think that would suffice to prove the existence of God, even if you can't observe God directly. But another thing we need to recognize that science is limited by the tools at our disposal. Like atoms weren't, detectable hundreds of years ago, but does that mean atoms don't exist? So we have to recognize that just because science can't prove something now doesn't mean it won't be able to in the future. And I hear atheists saying that same thing about like things that haven't been proven from their standpoint yet, like abiogenesis and other topics, maybe even the origin of the universe. So I think both sides are kind of waiting for advances. And I think it could go either way. I think our science could advance to a point where we see the reality of not just God, but things like heaven and hell. Or perhaps atheists will be vindicated and will discover answers to questions that, right now theists are claiming are on their side, or at least are still open for debate. So that's a good question, though. Yeah. So so basically, just to recapitulate this article, it appears that, and again, I highly recommend you read the entire thing on your own, but just to summarize, it appears that cells are capable of making decisions. And this is striking because currently science maintains that you have to have a brain to make decisions. And since single-celled organisms don't have a brain, because a brain requires multiple cells, many cells, in fact, the fact that they're making decisions is a serious puzzle. And it indicates that perhaps a mind is universal to not just higher level, more complex organisms, but even this. And if you obviously, I already read the article. It's not even that just cells are making decisions, but the components within cells are apparently able to solve problems that are arising within the cell as these chemicals and molecules carry out their duties within the cell. So how are chemicals and molecules solving problems where you would expect, if it was just physical laws governing their motion, they would just move along in a well-defined path, just bump into each other according to strict predictable laws of motion. But that's not what's happening. We can see within the cell that these components, if I keep using that word, are encountering obstacles, encountering resistance or whatever it may be, running into problems as you would expect, as they're solving them in real time. Because like it's kind of like thinking about, let's say you're trying to build the cell as these little molecular machines are. When you're building something, there's going to be problems that arise. Let's think about just a building. There's going to be things that arise. There are going to be things that get in the way. There are going to be things that happen that there's going to be rain days. There's going to be you know there's going to be obstacles. There's going to be maybe some equipment needs to be moved around that was put there earlier, and now it's in the way. You need to, whatever it is, when you're building something, you have to adapt to the circumstances. If you just are like a robot programmed to do like according to a strict set of motions, and something gets in your way, then you're just gonna bop into that thing and smash your face. But humans don't do that because we're making decisions. We're able to kind of maneuver around that. And yeah, you had one job. But what's amazing is that this is exactly what is being observed at the cellular level and the subcellular level. Things are apparently capable of solving these real-time problems in a way that's completely inexplicable right now by the laws of motion. So this is really, really fascinating stuff, and it really does challenge the mechanistic, mindless, materialistic paradigm that currently dominates science. So that's interesting. Speaking of brains, I thought this was pretty interesting. Directed evolution: the tiniest brain is not simple. So apparently, the nematode is the organism. Would you say that it's impossible for them to solve problems without brains? Well, according to the article I just read, they are solving the problems. And I guess I don't know. I think you might be referencing the cells themselves. If this is what they're doing it without a brain. So how that happens is, in my opinion, anybody's guess. I mean, we can theorize, but it's certainly, whatever the answer is, it doesn't seem to confirm. Oh, consciousness with not brains. That's a really interesting question, because if they're making decisions, that would seem to imply that these cellular components have some sort of consciousness, even though they're really just little, basically molecules and chemicals floating around in the cell. So this is really, really fascinating stuff. Now, again, this is speculation. We can't know if these little things are conscious, but based on what we understand about mind and matter, if they're making decisions, it would seem that they would need some sort of consciousness or awareness to do that. Now, whether that's the explanation or not, we can't really know, but that would seem to be indicated by what is observed as of where we are now. Critique says laws of physics is different on macroscopic and microscopic scales. Yeah, thing is, it can't be the law of physics, because if they're laws, then these things can't solve problems. They can't go outside of the bounds of what the laws would prescribe for them. So the fact that they're kind of adjusting their motion based on the circumstances is mysterious, to say the least. This could aid toward validating the existence of one consciousness and potentially. Yeah, I agree. It's not necessarily proof, but I would say it borders on proof that materialism is an insufficient explanation for what we're observing. Now, what the actual explanation is an interesting thought experiment, but I would say it could potentially invalidate materialistic philosophy. So, speaking of brains, there's apparently, I just thought this was kind of interesting. Nematodes are apparently the organism with the simplest brain. All right. So let's read a little bit here. The nematode worm, Canarhabditis elegans, I did not pronounce that correctly. I'm not going to pretend I did, but there it is, has the smallest brain in a free-living animal. So this is the organism with the smallest brain. It's they're called nematodes. All right. There are two forms of C. elegans, male and hermaphrodite. That's pretty fascinating as well. Apparently there's no female. The hermaphrodite brain contains only 302 neurons, and the male 385 neurons. So they have actually calculated the exact number of neurons in these creatures. And depending on its sex or whatever you want to call it, it will either have 385 neurons or it will have 302 neurons. So there is this very exact calculation going on here. The physical characteristics and brain design are different, but there is much in common. The entire body consists of approximately 900 cells and is only 1 millimeter long. Because of its small size, scientists have conducted a significant amount of research on the brain in the hope of discovering how brains in general function. A few years ago, researchers were able to determine the entire map of the brain, called a connectome, and published the results in the journal Nature. C. elegans is the first animal where this was accomplished. Even a cursory examination of the connectome shows the complexity of the brain despite its tiny size. Additional complexity is exhibited by the diversity of these types of neurons and the variety of connections. There are three basic types of neurons: sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. Sensory neurons respond to various stimuli, chemical, physical, etc. Motor neurons connect to muscles to control movement. And interneurons are generally intermediate between sensory and motor neurons. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of the article. Again, you can do that yourself. But here's what we want to take away from this. And again, this is not creationist propaganda. This is observable science that anyone can verify with a microscope, probably. The organism with the smallest brain that we've discovered so far is the nematode worm, which looks like this. All right, these are nematodes. The number of neurons in the brain of this organism is 385 and 302. So the one reason I think this is fascinating is because you go from 0 neurons in organisms without brains straight up to 385 neurons. Now, if you think about evolutionary history, how would it have probably progressed? If you're thinking about how brains might have developed, you would expect that it would go from 0 neurons to maybe 1 to maybe, I don't know, 2 neurons. I don't know. I'm just speculating here, but for me, when I think about evolution and how might have progressed, I think it would have gone for the first brain, whatever that looked like. It probably would have been only maybe at most a handful of neurons. Like thinking about how a neuron would evolve, it'd probably just be like one or a couple of them, in my opinion, and then it kind of progressed from there. But we have here that the simplest organism we've found so far has 385. That's a lot. I mean, that's obviously much smaller than a human brain. But to go straight from 0 to 385, it makes you wonder, where are all the creatures that had 1 neuron and 2 neurons and 3 neurons and 4 and so on, all the way up to 3? This creature has a very complex brain. But according to, I mean, even though it's not as complex as a human brain, it has different types of neurons. So what happened to all the creatures that are the transition from a brainless organism to this nematode? They don't exist anymore, apparently, so far as we've been able to find. To me, this represents what would necessarily be a quantum leap in evolution that isn't explained by Darwinian processes. When you go from 0 neurons to 385 and several types of neurons, that isn't something that just happens in a couple steps. That must have taken a long time, according to evolutionary theory and by evolutionary mechanisms. But the fact that the intermediate species don't exist, and there must have been a lot of them to get to this point, is quite puzzling. This is one of those evolutionary gaps that seems insurmountable to me. If the simplest brain we observe has, almost 300 to 400 neurons, you really have to wonder, why aren't there? This is not simple enough to be the first brained organism, but we don't see anything simpler than this. So where do they all go? Are they all extinct? Are they not preserved in any way that we can, what's going on here? It would seem that there is a gap that would be solved by these things were just specially created. You had organisms with no brains, and then the intelligent creator created a nematode that has a very sophisticated brain compared to a brainless organism. How else do you explain such a gap? And according to evolutionary theory, I really feel like there should be a number of steps in between this. And not just, when I say a number, I mean dozens, if not hundreds of organisms leading from brainless organisms up to where we see this. But since this is the organism with the simplest brain we found, I really think that this is quite startling. It seems reasonable to assume that their brains had fewer neurons in their evolutionary history. You would think, well, yes, you would think that, but the question is, where's the evidence of that? From what I can gather in 2 minutes, it seems that less complex organisms have what is called a neuron net instead of a brain. Some of these creatures apparently have fewer neurons than 300. Okay, well, that would perhaps solve the problem. And if you find okay, so I would need to do more research myself, but that would be something that could potentially solve the problem. Now, it makes me wonder, what exactly are these neuron nets? And can they really be said to bridge the gap between the organism without brains that existed in evolutionary history and the organisms with brains, starting with the nematode? That's an interesting question. So I'm going to put this as interesting, but not necessarily conclusive of anything. Doesn't necessarily refute evolution, but according to the information here given, it's certainly interesting. Just a couple more. So a Nobel Prize-winning scientist named Thomas, I'm gonna say his name is probably pronounced Czech or Chech, or maybe Sech. I really don't know how to pronounce his name. I'm sorry. On junk RNA. Here he is right here. We can add a Nobel Prize-winning biochemist Thomas Chech. I'm gonna pronounce his name Chech. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced, but I'm gonna go with it because it sounds like it might be like like one of those Russian names or whatever, like or Polish names where everything's ch. Thomas Chet's to ever-growing list of scientists who reject the junk DNA paradigm, or more pertinently, the junk RNA paradigm. RNA tends to get left as a side note in most discussions of genetics, much to Chet's annoyance. Dr. Chech has always been more interested in RNA than most of his colleagues, which led him to co-win the Nobel Prize in 1989 for discovering RNA's catalytic powers. Now Chech has written a book, The Catalyst, RNA and the Quest to Unlock Life's Deepest Secrets, W. W. Norton, on his adventures in RNA research. Towards the end, he discusses his perspective on the idea of genetic junk. Chech writes, the coding regions of all human genes that specify proteins make up only about 2% of our genome. When we add the introns that interrupt these coding regions, the sequences that are spliced out after the DNA is transcribed into the precursors to our mRNA, we account for another 24%. That leaves about 3/4 of the genome that is dark matter. For decades, this 75% was dismissed as junk DNA because whatever function it had, if any, was invisible to us. But as technologies for sequencing RNA have improved, scientists have discovered that most of this dark matter DNA is in fact transcribed into RNA. Some portion of this DNA is copied into RNA in the brain, other portions in the muscle or in the heart or in the sex organs. It's only when we add up the RNAs made in all the tissues of the body that we see the true diversity of human RNAs. The total number of RNAs made from DNA's dark matter has been estimated to be several 100,000. These are not messenger RNAs, but rather non-coding RNAs, the same general category as ribosomal RNA, transfer RNA, telomerase RNA, and microRNAs. But what they're doing is still, for the most part, a mystery. The RNAs that emerge from this dark matter are called long non-coding RNAs. While they are particularly numerous in humans, they are also abundant in other mammals, including laboratory mouse. In a few cases, they clearly have biological function. For example, an ink RNA called FIR contributes to the normal development of blood cells in mice. Basically going on, I'll read here. However, I'll point out these. There was a time in the not too distant past when telomerase RNA and microRNAs and catalytic RNAs weren't understood. They hadn't been assigned any function. They too could have been dismissed as noise or junk. But now hundreds of research scientists go to annual conferences to talk about these RNAs, and biotech companies are trying to use them to develop the next generation of pharmaceuticals. Certainly, one lesson we've learned from the story of RNA is never to underestimate its power. All right, it goes on from there. But basically, the point to recognize is this from this article. One thing you will always, I used to hear a lot from evolutionists, is how much junk there is in our DNA. How this just doesn't make sense from an intelligent design standpoint, because God, if he's so smart, would have made the DNA in a more efficient manner. He would have made it so everything's useful, essentially. But so what the argument was that DNA didn't look like anything that was created by something that was intelligent, because no intelligent being would design something with so much useless material. Or if God is the designer, God is just a really bad designer. But here we learn from this Nobel scientist what many people have been pointing on for years now, which it actually appears that this junk, quote unquote, junk DNA or junk RNA has functions because it's being coded. It's doing something. And while the article does admit we don't always know what that is, or for the most part, we don't know what's going on, the fact that it's being utilized at all signifies that it actually isn't junk DNA. Something's going on here. It appears that science has misled us. These scientists have misled us based on their theological presuppositions, or and actually, I'm going to read this right here. Retarding progress. Notice that the problem for Chech is not merely that he thinks junk RNA hypothesis is false. The problem is that it is a presupposition that could be holding back scientific progress. After all, the scientists who, in Chech's words, do not share my enthusiasm for these RNAs will not likely make discoveries about RNA they think is junk. It's scientists like Chech who's come to biology expecting plan and purpose who will. The implication of that is pretty significant. Darwinism is not turning out to be a fruitful heuristic for understanding genetics, since the lack of function in so-called genetic dark matter is, of course, a prediction of the Darwinian model. Here it is right here. The lack of function in so-called genetic dark matter is, of course, a prediction of the Darwinian model. The trouble is that there is another framework to take its place. Well, not an acceptable one. Okay, so basically, here's what's going on, folks. This is really a big problem for the evolutionists, because they have been making this argument for a long time. Because originally, we didn't have the technology or ability to see what was going on with this so-called junk DNA. So for decades, evolutionary scientists were calling it junk DNA and saying that it had no function, and therefore coming to the conclusion that, not necessarily scientifically, but philosophically, that this does not appear to be anything that would be intelligently designed by some sort of intelligent God or a smart God. But folks, I feel like they spoke too soon, because what is being discovered more and more day by day is that this genetic material does have a use. It is being utilized in some way. Even if we don't understand it, we can see it being used, or see that it's being put into play. So I think this is a really, really huge problem, and it really goes a long way to falsify a serious argument that has been put forward by a long time. If you have been watching this conversation, I still see people, atheists and skeptics and evolutionists, making the argument that junk DNA kind of refutes intelligent design because of what I've already said. It just doesn't make sense from that perspective. But what are they going to say when it's revealed that all this so-called genetic junk actually does have a function? Are they going to walk back? Are they going to change their mind? I don't know. But every day it appears like that's what's going on. It appears like this so-called junk DNA isn't junk at all. It actually has a function. And these scientists who have made these claims about it being junk have according to this Nobel Prize winner, held back science from understanding the true function and purpose of these parts of the genome. So this is really fascinating stuff, and it's worth knowing because it's something to be on the lookout for. Because this could falsify a serious line of argumentation from the evolutionary side. And he says, I've heard this argument put forth by atheists dozens of times. It's quite interesting refutation of the argument. Honestly, the concept of junk DNA RNA just seems counterintuitive to both the creator and to evolution. I can't see either one producing that much error. Yeah, well, I think that what we're learning is that this junk DNA really isn't junk DNA. It apparently does have a function in some way, and some of that function has already been discovered. So I've actually investigated this, believe it or not, folks. This is just one article. I've read a number of articles on this topic. Junk DNA is being refuted very much, and it's causing a huge problem for evolutionary theory. This isn't something I'm going to get into right now, but this is something that evolutionary theorists are trying to sweep under the rug. But for the last several years, this has been a creeping problem for them, that they have hung their hat on this junk DNA argument for a long, long time. I'm talking decades. And only in the last few years have they begun to discover the true meaning of what they thought was junk DNA. And now it's creating a revolution in biology that's not really many people talk about it because not many people think about science at this level. But for the people who are aware of it, it's quite fascinating, and it is revolutionary in a way. So I think people need to be aware of this information. All right, one more article, then we'll be done for today. Cold water on dire wolves. I don't know if y'all heard the story about a few weeks ago. Yeah, there's exactly not necessarily evolutionists, but biologists in general. Because you don't necessarily have to believe in evolution, in my opinion, to be a biologist. So I think all biologists benefit from this information, regardless of their stance on evolution. A couple weeks ago, there were a bunch of news articles about the fact that dire wolves had been brought back. Dire wolves were supposedly an extinct type of, or an organism, a type of creature that looked very much like a wolf, but were different in various ways. And it had clearly gone extinct. It is an extinct creature, sadly. But a couple weeks ago, there was a flurry of articles in the news and elsewhere on social media about how dire wolves had been brought back. And I just want to show you people that's not true. That did not happen. That is not at all what happened. Dire wolves, sadly, I would love for dire wolves to be brought back, but that is not what happened. What happened is, if you got excited about the hyped resurrection of dire wolves, let's see what this article was. Oh yeah, this is an article from Time magazine, which is kind of rad days. And the title of the article is "Return of the Dire Wolf." The tons and tons of articles were written like this all over the place. And what they were basically claiming, this is from April 5th, 2025 on Time magazine website, time.com. And but this wasn't the only one. There are many places claiming that dire wolves had been resurrected. They brought back from extinction. But alas, it was really a grand deception. It's not at all what happened. It was hype. It was scientific sensationalism, as is so often the case. All right, if you got excited about the hyped resurrection of dire wolves, a species evidently chosen as a tie-in in the Game of Thrones, get ready for a splash of cold water. Basically, I'm not going to go into it in too much depth, but I will read a couple choice sentences. Evolutionary biologist Neil Shubin takes down the claim from folks at Colossal Biosciences, the de-extinction company. These are not dire wolves. These are gray wolves with 20 edited genes. The way they are selling this is not only misleading, it doesn't do justice to the science that they are done and the application they will pursue. So, folks, this is what happened. They did not. We got Vaughn Eric in the chat. Always good to see you. They did not bring back dire wolves. What they did was they took gray wolves and they manipulated basically 20 genes within the genome of wolves, and basically changed their color and called it a dire wolf. So they turned gray wolves into a different color of not gray wolves, and I guess they kind of moved some things in the direction of a dire wolf genome. But basically, these things are slightly genetically manipulated gray wolves. They are not dire wolves. Dire wolves were not brought back from extinction. Okay, and here it is. These are not dire wolves. They are gray wolves with 20 edited genes. And a lot of people have recognized this by now. So this is not the most important news story on Earth, but I know a lot of people. I saw many people talking about the return of dire wolves, and I initially was very skeptical because I know how the scientific community loves to over sensationalize things that are being discovered or done. And of course, my suspicions were borne out. Dire wolves were not brought back from extinction. They took some gray wolves, manipulated some of their genes, most of which code for color in the fur. Let's see here. Yeah, I think this article right here. Okay, yeah, I'm going to end it right here. There's another article about it on this website that's pretty fascinating. But bottom line is you can go research. I just want people to understand that if you did see this, and many of you probably didn't, gray wolves, dire wolves were not brought back. It's just, I'm sorry for those of you who saw that and believed it, it didn't happen. Gray wolves, scientists took some gray wolves, changed the color of their fur, and maybe a couple other things, and called it a dire wolf. So, for perspective, gray wolves have roughly 20,000 genes. They manipulated 12. To be fair, the vast majority of the scientific community immediately rejected it. Yeah. The problem is, Andy, I know for a fact that many people saw these articles and they're still walking around. Not that it's a harmful thing to believe. Like, if there are people walking around there believing that dire wolves have come back from extinction, it's not really a problem. That's not a dangerous idea. But what is dangerous is just kind of believing things that are written in the news headlines and just not questioning it, like this. Like, a lot of them probably just saw the headlines and maybe read a sentence or two and were like, wow, dire wolves are brought back, cool. And they just think that. It's not a dangerous belief in itself, but what is dangerous is people accepting things without critically analyzing them, which is, I think everyone does that. But I will say, I think people of the skeptical / atheistic community do it because they kind of fancy themselves more like scientifically minded than religious people. But I don't think what's going on here, I don't think some of them realize that, even science can be manipulated, the way it's presented, the way the scientists kind of present their conclusions, or the way it's presented in popular media. You have to be really careful about that. So I think it's not necessarily that the story itself is false. I just think that so many people saw these headlines and went along with it. That's really what's more concerning to me, is people need to be more aware of the problems with just doing this. All right. Okay, so hold on one second. Mostly media sensationalism, if I had to guess. I don't think all of this information was the intention of the researchers. Yeah, I don't think the researchers had anything to do with it. I think it was people who saw the research and then kind of hijacked. Yeah, I don't think the researchers are to blame. I agree with you. It was other people who kind of relay scientific news for those who look into those kinds of things. Repent for the kingdom of hand. If you've extinct, you can't come back from extinction. So many articles to distract from the gospel message of salvation. Well, you have to understand, Freddie, a lot of people out there are operating under the mindset that science has disproven God. And that is built upon a number of so-called facts that they have in their mind. Okay, so if you can show them that the facts that they have in the mind that make them think that science has disproven God are incorrect, that could lead them back to a relationship with God, which would then lead to a relationship with Jesus Christ and thus salvation. Okay, so this is all important. If somebody's stumbling block to a relationship with God is science and thinking that science disproves God, then understanding science and how it actually points to God can be the most helpful thing for someone in that particular mindset. So I really think you need to take that into consideration. Hello, Dirty Varmint. Good to see you. Science can never disprove God. I agree with you. Yeah, I would say, well, I definitely don't think science can currently disprove God, but what science can do is make it seem like God is not a necessary hypothesis for what we're observing. If you're telling people that God isn't necessary to explain X, Y, or Z, but science doesn't actually show that, then you're kind of missing. I'm not saying you, Andy, but I'm saying when that happens, those people have been misinformed, and thus that is inhibiting their relationship with God. Um, so there are many people who think that their understanding of science basically relegates God to an unnecessary idea. It's for explaining things. But I think that what needs to be understood is that there are real scientific observations that show that, first of all, some things that scientists claim they knew aren't actually things they knew, like the junk DNA thing. And also, science just still has a lot of explaining to go. Like, how do cells without brains make decisions? How do chemical molecular components within cells apparently make decisions? Science, this is really difficult stuff under our current scientific paradigm. The kind of Newtonian, mechanistic, physicalist, materialistic idea that currently dominates science. So these are just things for people to think about as they go about their lives and try to make these decisions. Yeah, there's a lot of people like that, and I'm not. It doesn't. I can understand that perspective, but uh, and it's quite popular. But I think that it's something that needs to be kind of addressed. And I think if Christians did this more instead of constantly arguing with each other about like um what are the kind of things like whether the sky is gonna whether tomorrow is gonna be the last day of Earth or not, things like that. They actually address things that are actually affecting people's lives and affecting how they think about God right now. It'd be much more beneficial. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to show people that science, there are observations within science that kind of show the primacy of mind, the primacy of consciousness, the idea that maybe an intelligence had something to do with the creation of everything. Not that we have all the answers for sure, but just that this is things to think about and are kind of tending in that direction. So yeah, well, some people have. So if this, maybe this information, but hopefully someone who does think that way will see this and maybe it'll show them that there's a different way to look at it. All right, guys, and everyone who watched, I have to go. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and if that's something you want to do. I plan on doing more of these in the future. These ID updates. Just be looking for shows in general. Be looking. Think the next one maybe have another discussion sometime coming up. Just whatever I feel like doing when I feel like doing it. But I appreciate everyone paying attention and watching, and hope to see you again. And I hope this helped. All right, next live stream, best guitar solo ever. You might be talking about me. I'll work on it. If someone else wants to have a little talent show, then that'd be something we can do. All right. God bless everybody. Until next time.